Serafina didn't know that the stranger hunting her through the darkened library was the most powerful man in the kingdom. She only knew the sound of his boots on marble, slow and deliberate, like a predator who had already caught the scent of prey. The royal archives stretched 3 stories high, filled with shadows and the musty perfume of ancient texts. Moonlight filtered through the arched windows, casting silver rectangles across the floor that she carefully avoided. Her heart hammered so loud she was certain it would betray her. She pressed her back against the cold stone behind the philosophy section, her stolen documents clutched to her chest. 3 years of planning. 3 years of surviving the cruelty of Lord Varen's household as a servant, waiting for the perfect moment to find proof of his treasons. And now, on the very night she'd finally gotten her hands on the evidence that would free her village from his tyranny, someone else had broken into the archives. The footsteps stopped. Serafina held her breath. Through the gap between leather spines, she could see a figure at the end of the row, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black, his face obscured by shadow. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, listening. Then he moved. Not toward the exit, not away from her, directly toward the philosophy section. Her fingers trembled against the papers. She couldn't be caught. Not now. Not when she was so close. Serafina dropped low, crawling beneath the bottom shelf into the next row. Dust coated her tongue. Her servant's dress caught on a splinter, and she yanked it free, the small, tearing sound impossibly loud in the silence. The footsteps changed direction, coming around the shelf, following her. She scrambled to her feet and ran, no longer caring about stealth. Her bare feet slapped against the cold floor as she wove between the towering shelves, deeper into the labyrinth of the archives. The stranger's pursuit was unhurried but relentless, always seeming to anticipate which way she would turn. Left, right, through the poetry section, past the war histories, into the restricted collection where the shelves grew closer together and the darkness thickened. Dead end. Serafina spun, pressing her back against the wall of books behind her. There was nowhere left to run. She could hear him approaching, his footsteps echoing closer, and she did the only thing she could think of. She squeezed herself into the narrow gap between the last shelf and the corner, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The moonlight didn't reach this far into the archives. The darkness was almost absolute. She could only see shapes, outlines, the suggestion of books and furniture. But she could hear him breathing. He stopped at the entrance to the restricted section. For a long moment, nothing. Then the whisper of fabric as he moved between the shelves. Closer. Closer still. Serafina's lungs burned from holding her breath. Her eyes strained against the darkness, trying to find him, but there was only shadow. A soft sound. Leather sliding against leather. Then light bloomed in the darkness, warm and golden, and a book was pulled aside from the shelf in front of her hiding place. Through the gap, she found herself staring directly into a pair of amber eyes that seemed to glow in the candlelight he'd conjured. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Found you?" The voice was deep, rough like gravel wrapped in velvet. It sent an involuntary shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. Well? Not entirely fear. Before she could react, he reached through the gap and the shelf itself swung outward. A hidden door. She hadn't even known it was there. He stepped into the small alcove where she'd been hiding, and suddenly the space felt impossibly smaller. He was even larger up close, towering over her crouched form. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. The candlelight he held revealed features that were almost too perfect, too precise, as if someone had carved him from stone and then breathed life into the sculpture. But there was nothing cold about the heat in his eyes as he looked down at her. Most people run out of the archives when they're caught. His head tilted, studying her. You ran deeper in. Serafina's mind raced. She was still clutching the stolen documents. If he was one of Lord Varen's men, if he reported her, everything was lost. her village, her family, the proof of the murders and extortion and countless other cruelties. "I wasn't caught," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You haven't caught me yet." His eyebrows rose. Something shifted in his expression, something like interest replacing the cool assessment. "You're hiding in a corner with nowhere to run." He held up the candle, its light dancing across her face. "How exactly have I not caught you?" "Because I'm going to offer you a deal." Before we continue, please take 2 seconds to like this video. It tells me you want more stories like this. The stranger went very still. The candlelight flickered, casting strange shadows across his features. "A deal? You're here to steal something." Serafina forced herself to stand, ignoring the trembling in her legs. She had to look him in the eye, had to seem confident even if her heart was trying to beat its way out of her chest. "So am I, which means we're both criminals tonight. If you report me, I report you. Mutual destruction." Assuming anyone would believe a servant over me. Her stomach dropped. He knew. Of course he knew. Her rough spun dress, her calloused hands, the smudge of kitchen soot she hadn't quite managed to scrub from her cheek. Everything about her screamed her station. "They would believe the documents I found." She held up the papers between them like a shield. "Lord Varen's records, every bribe he's taken, every law he's broken, every person he's had killed. If I'm caught with these, I burn them and tell them exactly where to find the copies. If you let me go, they never know you were here at all." The stranger stared at her for a long moment. The candlelight caught the amber of his eyes, and she realized with a start that there was gold in them. Actual gold, threaded through the brown like veins of precious metal through stone. Number. Not possible. "You broke into the royal archives," he said slowly, "to steal evidence against a lord, to expose his crimes, to free my village from his tyranny. He's been bleeding us dry for years, demanding impossible taxes, taking whatever he wants. Anyone who resists disappears." Her voice cracked despite herself. "My father was the last to disappear, 6 months ago. I know Varen had him killed. I just needed proof." Something flickered across the stranger's face. It was gone too quickly to identify, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And if you expose him? What then? You think the courts will side with a servant against a lord? I think the king will." He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor. "The king? King Kalen is supposed to be just." Serafina lifted her chin. "He's supposed to protect his people, even the ones who are poor, even the ones who are no one. If I can get this evidence to him, if I can make him see what Varen has done, maybe he'll actually do something about it." The stranger studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The gold in his eyes seemed to brighten, but surely that was just a trick of the candlelight. "You have a lot of faith in a man you've never met." "I have faith that someone has to care. Someone with power. Someone who can actually stop men like Varen." She met his strange golden gaze without flinching. "I have to believe that. Or everything I've done, everything I've sacrificed, means nothing." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The candle burned lower, wax dripping down over his fingers, but he didn't seem to notice or care. He was looking at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled. It transformed his face completely, softening the sharp edges, making him look younger and somehow more dangerous all at once. The kind of danger that had nothing to do with violence, and everything to do with the way her heart stuttered in response. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met," he said, "or the most foolish. Can't I be both?" The smile widened. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. But somehow, despite every survival instinct screaming at her to run, Serafina found herself following as he turned and walked back through the archives. The hidden door swung shut behind them, leaving no trace it had ever been there. "I'm not giving you the documents," she said, hurrying to match his longer stride. "I didn't ask for them." "Then what do you want?" He stopped at one of the large reading tables, setting the candle down on its surface. The warm light spread outward, revealing the dust motes dancing in the air, the towering shelves surrounding them, the faded grandeur of the ancient library. "Sit," he said. Serafina didn't sit. The stranger sighed, but there was something like approval in his expression. "Fine. Stand." He pulled out a chair for himself and dropped into it with the casual grace of someone accustomed to commanding any space he occupied. "Tell me everything you know about Lord Varen. Every crime, every victim, every detail you've been able to find." "Why?" "Because you're right. Someone with power should stop men like him." Those golden eyes met hers across the candlelight. "And because I'm curious to see if your proof is as damning as you believe it to be." She should have walked away. Should have taken her documents and disappeared into the night while she still had the chance. But there was something in his voice, something in the way he looked at her, that made her hesitate. "Who are you?" "Someone who might be able to help you. If your evidence is real." "It's real." "Then prove it." Serafina set her jaw and spread the documents across the table between them. For the next hour, she walked him through everything: the falsified tax records, the correspondence with criminal organizations, the list of names. Each one someone who had defied Varen and vanished. Her father's name was third from the bottom. The stranger listened without interrupting. His expression grew darker as she spoke, his jaw tightening, the gold in his eyes seeming to burn hotter. By the time she finished, his hands were clenched on the arms of his chair. "This is enough," he said quietly. "More than enough." "Enough for what?" He stood, and suddenly he seemed larger than before, filling the space with an authority that hadn't been visible when he was seated. "Enough to destroy him." Serafina's heart leaped. "You'll help me? You'll take this to the king?" Something complicated moved across his features. He reached out, and his fingers brushed against hers as he gathered the documents. The touch sent a shock through her, electric and strange, like touching a live wire. She jerked her hand back, her cheeks flushing. If he noticed her reaction, he didn't show it. "Come with me." "Where?" "To the palace." The air left her lungs. "The palace? Now? In the middle of the night?" "The king doesn't sleep well." That almost smile again, like a secret joke she wasn't privy to. "And this evidence needs to be seen immediately, before Varen has a chance to realize it's been taken and cover his tracks." It was insane. She was a servant who had just committed treason by stealing from the royal archives. Walking into the palace was practically begging to be arrested. But if there was even a chance, if this stranger could actually get her an audience with the king, if she could finally get justice for her father and her village, she had to take it. "All right," she said. "I'll go with you." They slipped out of the archives through a servant's entrance that Serafina hadn't known existed. The stranger moved through the shadows like he'd been born to them, avoiding guards with an ease that spoke of long practice. Serafina followed close behind, her heart in her throat, her bare feet silent on the cold stone. The palace rose before them, gleaming white in the moonlight. It was even more magnificent than she'd imagined, all soaring towers and delicate spires and windows that glittered like captured stars. The kind of place that existed in fairy tales, not in the life of a servant girl from a dying village. The stranger led her not to the main gates, but to a small door hidden in an ivy-covered wall. He produced a key from somewhere inside his coat and unlocked it, gesturing for her to enter. "This feels like a trap," she said. "It's not." That's exactly what someone would say if it were a trap. He turned to face her, and in the moonlight his features looked almost otherworldly. The sharp angles of his face, the impossible gold of his eyes, the way the shadows seemed to bend around him like they were afraid to touch him. "Do you trust me?" he asked. It was such a ridiculous question. She'd known him for barely 2 hours. He was a stranger who had hunted her through a library and dragged her secrets out of her with nothing more than a few pointed questions and a candle flame. But something inside her, something deeper than logic, answered before her mind could catch up. "Yes." His expression softened just for a moment. Then he held out his hand. Serafina took it. His palm was warm against hers, his fingers strong as they curled around her own. The same electric shock moved through her, but this time she didn't pull away. She let him lead her through the hidden door, into a narrow corridor lit by torches, and up a spiraling staircase that seemed to go on forever. When they finally emerged, she found herself in a hallway more opulent than anything she'd ever seen. Tapestries lined the walls, depicting battles and coronations and mythical beasts. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, their surfaces catching the torchlight and scattering it like diamonds. "Wait here," the stranger said. He released her hand and walked to a set of massive double doors at the end of the hall. The guards stationed on either side saw him approach and immediately bowed low, reaching to open the doors without a single question asked. Serafina's blood turned to ice. She watched as the stranger walked through the doors and disappeared into the room beyond. Watched as the guards closed the doors behind him and resumed their positions, still not sparing her a second glance. The guards had bowed. Not nodded. Not acknowledged. Bowed. The kind of bow you gave to royalty. Oh no. Oh no no no. The double doors swung open again and the stranger reappeared. But he wasn't alone. A woman walked beside him, dressed in the elaborate gown of a court lady, her silver hair piled high upon her head. She was saying something to him in low, urgent tones, but he wasn't listening. His eyes found Serafina immediately, and something in his expression made her take an involuntary step backward. "Lady Marin," he said, cutting off the woman mid-sentence, "please see that our guest is given appropriate chambers. She'll be staying in the palace for the foreseeable future." "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular. If the council learns you've brought a commoner into the royal wing in the middle of the night, there will be questions." "Your Majesty." The world tilted. Serafina's vision narrowed to a single point, that impossible golden gaze still fixed on her face, and she understood. The stranger wasn't going to take her evidence to the king. The stranger was the king. "Your Majesty," she breathed. King Kalin, ruler of the realm, terror of his enemies, the most powerful man in the kingdom, smiled that same dangerous smile she'd seen in the archives. "Now," he said softly, "we can discuss Lord Varen properly." Serafina woke to sunlight streaming through windows that took up an entire wall. For a long, confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed beneath her was impossibly soft, the linen smoother than anything she'd ever touched. The room was larger than the entire house she'd grown up in. Then memory crashed back, and she sat up so fast her head spun. The king. She'd threatened to expose the king. She'd demanded he let her go. She'd lectured him about justice and duty and what a ruler should be while he sat there in his black clothes, playing the part of a common thief. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat. She was either about to be executed or she'd gone completely mad. Possibly both. A soft knock at the door made her jump. Before she could respond, it opened to reveal Lady Marin, the silver-haired woman from the night before. Her expression was coolly assessing as she looked Serafina over. "His Majesty requests your presence at breakfast." It didn't sound like a request. "I've had appropriate clothing sent up. You have 20 minutes. She was gone before Serafina could ask any of the 1,000 questions crowding her mind. The clothing turned out to be a gown of deep emerald green, finer than anything Serafina had ever worn. She dressed with shaking hands, struggling with the unfamiliar fastenings, and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. 20 minutes later, a servant appeared to lead her through the winding palace corridors. They passed courtiers and guards who stared at her with open curiosity, whispers following in her wake. She kept her chin high and her shoulders back, refusing to show how terrified she was. The breakfast room was smaller than she'd expected, intimate rather than grand. King Kalin sat at a table near the windows, morning sunlight catching the gold in his eyes and turning his dark hair bronze at the edges. He looked different in the daylight, still impossibly handsome but somehow more human. Less like a creature from legend and more like a a man who had hunted her through a library and smiled when she'd threatened him. "Please," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit. Eat." This time, she sat. The food was exquisite, delicate pastries and fresh fruit and things she couldn't even identify. Serafina forced herself to take a few bites even though her stomach was in knots. "You didn't tell me who you were," she said finally. "You didn't ask. I called you a common thief. Technically, you called us both criminals. An accurate assessment, given that I was also breaking into the archives." She stared at him. "Why? You're the king. The archives are yours. The council thinks otherwise." Something dark flickered across his face. "They've been very careful about what information reaches me. There are factions at court who prefer a king who doesn't ask too many questions, who doesn't look too closely at how his lords treat his people." Understanding dawned slowly. "You were looking for the same thing I was. Evidence against Varen. Among others." He set down his cup, meeting her gaze directly. "I inherited a kingdom that's been rotting from the inside for decades. My father was content to let the lords do as they pleased as long as they kept paying taxes. I am not." The gold in his eyes seemed to burn brighter. "But I can't move against them without proof, and the proof has been very carefully hidden. Until I stole it. Until you stole it." That dangerous smile again. "A servant girl who broke into the most secure library in the realm, evaded my pursuit far longer than anyone should have been able to, and then had the audacity to threaten the king to his face." He leaned forward, and she caught the scent of him, pine and something smoky. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish." "You said that already." "It bears repeating." Serafina's heart was doing something strange, fluttering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She forced herself to focus. "What happens now? To Varen? To my village?" "Lord Varen has already been arrested. I sent guards to his estate last night with orders to take him into custody." Kaelin's expression hardened. "When I'm finished with him, he'll wish he'd never been born." The words should have frightened her. Instead, they sent a rush of fierce satisfaction through her chest. "And your village will be placed under the crown's direct protection," he continued. "The taxes Varen collected will be returned. Homes will be rebuilt. Justice will be done." She hadn't expected to cry. Hadn't expected the tears that suddenly blurred her vision, or the sob that caught in her throat. 3 years of fighting and planning and surviving, and it was over. It was actually over. "Hey." Kaelin's voice was suddenly closer, softer. She looked up through her tears to find that he'd moved around the table to crouch beside her chair. His hand hovered near her shoulder, not quite touching. "You did this. You saved them." "My father is still dead." "Yes." He didn't offer false comfort, and somehow that made it easier to bear. "But his murderer will face justice, and his daughter will be the one who brought him down. I think he would have been proud." The tears fell faster. Serafina pressed her hands to her face, mortified to be crying in front of the king, but unable to stop. Everything she'd been holding back for 3 years came pouring out, the grief and the rage and the desperate hope that had kept her going even when it seemed impossible. A warm weight settled on her shoulder. She looked up to find Kaelin's hand there, steady and grounding. His golden eyes were soft in a way she hadn't seen before. "You don't have to be strong right now," he said quietly. "You've been strong for long enough." She didn't know who moved first. One moment she was sitting in her chair, tears streaming down her face. The next she was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, his hand stroking her hair as she cried. He held her like she was something precious, something worth protecting, and she let herself fall apart in the safety of his embrace. When the tears finally slowed, she pulled back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. That was improper. You're the king, and I'm just a servant. You're not just anything." His thumb brushed across her cheek, wiping away a lingering tear. "And I believe we established last night that I'm not much of a king when it comes to following rules." A watery laugh escaped her. You did chase me through a library. Best decision I ever made. The way he was looking at her made her breath catch, like she was the most fascinating thing in the world, like he could see straight through to her soul and found something there worth keeping. Your Majesty, I should go. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Back to my village. They need to know what happened. They've already been informed. His hand was still on her face, cradling her jaw like she might break. Stay. At least until we're certain Varen's allies won't try to retaliate against you. I can't stay in the palace. I'm a servant. You're my guest. His eyes searched hers. Please, stay. It was still improper. Still impossible. She was no one, a girl from a dying village who had no business being in a palace, let alone being held by a king. But that strange, deep knowing inside her, the same knowing that had made her trust him in the dark of the archives, said yes before her mind could object. All right, she breathed. I'll stay. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Serafina had ever experienced. She was given chambers in the guest wing, surrounded by luxury that still felt like a dream. She was given tutors to teach her the ways of court, dressmakers to ensure she had appropriate clothing, ladies-in-waiting who seemed torn between disdain for her common origins and fascination with her favor from the king. Because there was no denying that Kaelin favored her. He sought her out daily, inviting her to walk in the gardens, to dine with him in his private chambers, to sit beside him during council meetings where he tore apart the lords who had preyed on his people for so long. He listened to her opinions and asked for her advice, and looked at her with those impossible golden eyes like she was the only person in the room. The court whispered. The court always whispered. Serafina learned to ignore it. What she couldn't ignore was the way her heart raced whenever he was near, the way her skin tingled when he touched her, even casually, the way she lay awake at night, remembering the feel of his arms around her and wanting things she had no right to want. 2 months after her arrival at the palace, everything changed. They were in the library, not the royal archives, but Kaelin's private collection, a warm room full of comfortable chairs and books that looked like they'd actually been read. Serafina had discovered he was a voracious reader, devouring everything from military strategy to poetry to obscure philosophy. He'd started lending her books, and she'd started spending her evenings here, reading while he worked through the endless piles of correspondence that came with ruling a kingdom. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her page. "You're beautiful." The book slipped from her fingers. She scrambled to catch it, her face burning, and when she looked up, Kaelin was standing right in front of her. "Your Majesty, I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to. That is to say, I should probably just go and never come back. Please don't." He knelt before her chair, bringing his face level with hers. This close, she could see the individual threads of gold woven through the amber of his eyes. "I've been trying to say this for weeks. I've started the words 100 times and lost my nerve every time. But tonight, watching you sit there in the firelight with your hair falling out of its pins and that little furrow between your brows that you get when you're concentrating, I can't stay silent anymore." Kaelin. His name, not his title. She'd never called him by his name before. His breath caught. "Say that again." "Kaelin." He kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip the front of his shirt, and the kiss deepened into something that made her entire body ignite. His hands tangled in her hair, scattering pins across the floor. Her fingers found the buttons of his jacket. They were both breathing hard when they finally broke apart. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I've loved you since you looked me in the eye and threatened to expose me as a criminal. I've loved you since you cried in my arms and let me see your grief. I've loved you every moment of every day since, and I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "I'm no one," she whispered. "I'm a servant, a commoner. The court will never accept me. The court will accept what I tell them to accept. And if they don't, I'll burn the whole thing down and build something better. His forehead pressed against hers, his eyes blazing gold. You are everything, Serafina. You are my equal, my partner, my heart. Please, let me love you. The tears came again, but this time they were different. This time they were joy. Yes, she breathed. Yes. 3 months later, Serafina stood in the palace chapel, dressed in a gown of white and gold, and became queen of the realm. The months that followed were challenging. There were factions at court who despised her common origins, who plotted and schemed to see her removed. There were assassination attempts and poisonings and whispered campaigns to turn the people against her. Serafina faced them all with the same determination that had carried her through the archives that night. She was no longer hiding behind shelves. She was standing at her husband's side, ruling a kingdom, fighting for justice with every breath she took. And through it all, Kaelin was there. Her partner, her protector, her love. They were reading together in the library when she felt the first flutter of movement in her belly. She gasped, her hand flying to the barely visible swell beneath her gown. Kaelin was at her side instantly. What is it? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. She took his hand and pressed it to her stomach. Feel. The flutter came again, stronger this time. Kaelin's eyes went wide, the gold in them blazing brighter than she'd ever seen. That's our child, he breathed. That's our child. He dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead against her belly, and she felt the wetness of tears soaking through the fabric of her dress, her fingers tangled in his hair, holding him close. I love you, he said, the words muffled against her stomach. Both of you. I love you both so much. We love you too. Serafina smiled down at the crown of his head, at the king who had chased her through a library and changed her entire world. Always. In the end, it turned out that the most dangerous thing in the kingdom wasn't a corrupt lord or a scheming court. It was love, and it had found her hiding behind the library's shelves. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts. And if you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps more people hear these stories.